So we're going to talk about ancient aliens and secret societies, and the book really took me in different places than I expected it to. It started out, I was going to do a chapter on the Great Flood. I was going to do a quickie chapter on, the fact that civilizations seem to have started at high altitude and then they've descended down from there. But it really ended up kind of taking over and having a life of its own. So this is a quote from James George Fraser, who wrote a book called Folklore in the Old Testament, and he said, "It has long been known that legends of a great flood in which almost all men perished are widely diffused over the world." Now, there are people that will claim that in reality that this is just pollution from, cultural pollution from, missionaries going to different parts of the world and convincing the natives of the flood story, but it's absolutely not true, and we're going to get into that a little bit. There is, in reality, a consistent flood myth from pretty much every ancient culture that is in existence. They all have some sort of flood myth, and they're all very similar to each other, as if they were told the same story. And these can be documented to have been within their culture, their oral traditions, for thousands of years in many cases. So it's definitely not true that this is a modern cultural pollution phenomenon. So as we start thinking about the Great Flood, I started thinking, okay, did it really happen? Did it really change things? Was there a prior advanced civilization, an Atlantean kind of civilization that was controlled by visitors? Was this the Anunnaki that Sitchin talks about? How much of this stuff is true? And so what I wanted to know is I started asking a few questions, and one of them were, what ended the last ice age? What caused this, what's known as the Younger Dryas freeze, where everything seemed to be getting warmer, and then all of a sudden there was this very, very cold period of about 1,200 years that the Earth went through, and could it have been caused by something called the Younger Dryas impact event? Now, the Younger Dryas impact event is a period that is called, guess what? The Younger Dryas. This is an image of the Earth at the dawn of the Pleistocene of the current era. That is, slides. I did just laser him. I can't believe I just nailed him. And the ice extended all the way through pretty much all of Europe, down through North America. The glaciers came all the way down to virtually Northern California. We were basically an ice planet with a very, very thin temperate band where you could have a civilization. And something about 12,000, 13,000 years ago changed that and shifted it. And we came out of this ice age and the Earth started getting warmer. Now, don't believe any of this global warming, climate change crap. That's all political. That's not actually happening. The Earth has been getting warmer for about 12 or 13,000 years, and these are part of normal cycles that happen with the Earth. It gets colder, it gets warmer, but there has to be something that precipitates it. And the question is, what could have made that happen? What could have started this? And for me, it could be, I thought, maybe some kind of impact event. So I started looking around. I started reading a little bit about what Graham Hancock's been working on. Besides ayahuasca and weed. And I don't know, I just personally, it's like, I think when you start taking hallucinogenic drugs, I just think your credibility kind of goes out the window. But I think Graham, regardless of that, has done brilliant work that we have to pay attention to. But it's like, I don't know. You'll never see me taking ayahuasca, let's put it that way. Because I think I can figure things out without doing LSD, basically. So this is the recent period of time that we've been. Next slide, please. This is the recent period of time that we've gone through in terms of the last 12, 13, 14,000 years. We were in a period where things were getting warmer. Then we had a series of events that took place right around 12,000 years ago. On the right side of the scale, let me see if I can actually read it here. And what happened is that the Younger Dryas cold event terminated right about 11,600 BC. We had this event that took place right around 12,000 years before present, and really nobody understands what happened except in the context of some sort of impact on the planet Earth. Because what took place was that all the flora and fauna basically died off, all the humans died off dramatically. The Earth became a place that was very, very difficult to live for about 12 or 1,300 years. Now, the question is, what caused that? Well, there's a scientist named Randall Carlson who is, I guess you could call him an amateur geologist, although there's nothing amateur about his work. He's not He's not a degreed geologist, but he's got a website called cosmographicresearch.com, and he basically has been arguing for several years for what he calls the Younger Dryas impact event. And what that is a comet that hit the North Pole of the planet Earth about 12,800 BC. Now, if you look at the distribution of what are called nanodiamonds, these are very, very tiny diamonds that are created under extreme pressure and extreme heat very, very quickly. There's a pattern that actually goes all the way through Europe, all the way across the ocean. Well, my pointer's not going to work. All the way across the ocean into North America. And in fact, they've actually now got at least 22 specific impacts of this object that broke up over the Earth as it was coming up over the North Pole and struck these glaciers. Well, when an object hits, an object that's traveling, I don't know, 40, 50,000 miles an hour, hits the atmosphere, heats up, and then strikes glaciers that are hundreds of miles thick, full of water, ice. What do you think is going to happen? What's going to happen is that all of the stuff all that ice is going to get launched into the upper atmosphere. And it could, in fact, account for the flood myths that we've all seen and heard. So I started a correspondence with him, and one of the things that he did is he actually mapped catastrophic floods. And what you find is that all through North America there are catastrophic floods. There are ones on the East Coast, there's ones on the West Coast, there's the Missoula flood basin, there's the Bonneville flood, the Colorado Plateau. These are all areas where there were probably fragments of this object struck and instantly melted the glaciers, vaporized a lot of the water, and put a lot of it up into the air as water droplets, which then came down and caused these incredible catastrophic melts and catastrophic floods. There are also indications of the same kinds of floods in Russia, in Siberia, but the Russians are just beginning to admit that this is the case, and they're just beginning to look at it in a scientific, realistic way. So, as an example, how much water would it take to move a boulder this size? Look at the size of that thing. That is in the Missoula area. It's part of the Missoula flood. It would take an incredible amount of energy to move a rock that big and deposit it here. Yet, in fact, that's what we see all over North America, is boulders of this size and even larger scattered all over the place. So that's an indication that there definitely was this catastrophic, enormous flood that took place in North America at that time. So as you look at the different cultures that have various flood myths, this is just an example of about 32 that have been put together, put together by some independent researchers, and they all have the same kinds of stories. They have a story that to the effect that there's going to be a great deluge by water, that man is warned by God or gods that this is going to take place. In most cases, there is the story of an ark that is built for mankind to survive the catastrophic flood that is to come. So obviously an advanced technological civilization would be able to understand and see that an impact like this was going to take place, and they would be able to warn the fairly primitive citizens of the planet Earth at that time. And it appears that that's the case, because you've got these same kinds of stories excuse me, from all over the world, including as far as New Zealand and Alaska. New Zealand and Alaska are pretty far from each other. Into Russia, the Eskimo stories, it basically covers the entire planet Earth. So you even have stories in the desert Southwest. Frank Waters is the author of the Book of the Hopi, and there's a story that he picked up a Hopi chieftain on the road one day, and the guy told him the whole story about what had happened to the Hopi people and how the last world of man had been destroyed by a great flood, and the next world would be destroyed by some other cataclysm which is yet to occur and hopefully won't. And so you've got these stories that even go into our own ancient cultures here in North America. These are some of the Hopi drawings of the ant people, the so-called ant people that helped the few Hopi that were able to survive the entire thing and escape this massive flood. And again, if you look at them, and you've certainly seen this kind of thing on Ancient Aliens, they look to me like aliens. They look like your typical gray aliens. So then I started asking some more questions along the lines of, okay, would an impact like that be enough to cover the earth for 40 days and 40 nights of rain? And the answer is possibly, because what would happen is that the water would go up in the air, it would then come back down in the form of rain, and this could last a long, long time. But there's another idea out there that has been pushed by some of the Christian churches and Christian scholars of what's called the water vapor canopy theory of the earth. And that idea is that the earth was covered with a heavy, thick canopy of water vapor suspended between the lower atmosphere and the upper atmosphere that protected the planet Earth. And it's interesting because as you read through the Bible, you see stories about the flood and the fact that there were no rainbows on the earth until after the flood, because the water vapor the sunlight never actually got all the way through this heavy, thick layer of water. And if you had something like that did exist, and it was pierced by an object, a very large object moving at a very rapid rate of speed, you could again shatter this suspended water vapor and bring it all down to the earth in the form of rain. And 40 days and 40 nights would probably be the minimum amount of time that would rain. There's actually been hurricanes that have taken place where they've stalled over Tennessee in the 1960s, where the rain was so intense that birds actually drowned in trees. I mean, they drowned because there was so much water coming down that they couldn't survive. So this idea that there could be a great flood of the earth is theoretically possible. And now the water vapor canopy theory comes under a lot of criticism. People say, oh, the air pressure would be really, really high and all this stuff, and you wouldn't be able to survive. But it's also true that you would be able in those circumstances to basically live at altitudes as high as, let's say, Mount Kilimanjaro or what's the big one? Mount Everest. You could actually live there, and the increased air pressure means you would simply live at a higher altitude. Now, if you were down at sea level, it might be very uncomfortable, but at higher altitudes, you'd be fine. It'd be a very nice, warm, temperate climate. The Christians also argue, and I'm not saying the Christians like the aliens or the Greys. It's not, but they also argue that if you look at the Bible, you look at the ages of men in the Bible, what you see is that they started out living these very long lives, 900 years, 800 years. It seems like after they had kids, then within a very short time after having the kids, they'd die. I don't know what the deal is with that, but maybe it's an indication not to have kids too soon. You wait at least 600 years before you have kids. That's what I'm saying. And the explanation is that if you had this water vapor canopy, you actually would be protected from a lot of the harmful cosmic rays that damage our DNA and cause aging. So it might be true that these really exceptionally long-lived people in the past were long-lived because they had the protection of this water vapor canopy. So as I'm digging through this stuff, I'm thinking, okay, well, this all makes sense, and there is a reality that it's probable that we could have this rain, but then what you would have to have then logically is after the floods receded, those few who survived, there'd have to be some signature of that, right? And the signature would have to be that civilization would have to start at high altitude. And guess what? Lo and behold, when you look at it, civilization does start at high altitudes. These are what they call terraced cultures. These are in, I believe this is in Peru, the tops of mounds, the tops of mountains. You see these terraces. These are all farming terraces that were created by very, very early cultures. Here's another example. And they, this is how they did their agriculture. But it's like, why would you do this on the top of the mountain if you had a perfectly good valley below? Unless maybe that valley didn't exist at that time. What you had was this massive receding floodwater. So, again, here's another example of some ruins in Turkey of very, very high altitude at about 6,500 feet. And then you have other ruins in other parts of the world. This is in South America, of a society that was built basically on the top of a mountain. And, of course, you have Nazca in Peru. You have Machu Picchu. This is an area in Armenia where, again, they have these mounds and mountains, and these are the highest areas the highest sites in the area for hundreds of miles around, and they have all these terraces where mankind worked the land and grew food. And, of course, you have like Machu Picchu, which is way, way up there, the top of the world. Anybody been there? Yeah, is that what it is? Is it? I'd love to go sometime. We're gonna have to go do that sometime. It's what?
It's only 7,000.
Only 7,000 feet, but remember that's 7,000 feet. That's, as the waters receded, that's just where they came down and built these things. Now, the king of them all is the newest one, which is Göbekli Tepe, or Göbekli Tepe. I don't know. Göbekli, is that how I got it? Which is a bizarre. It's a bizarre architectural site. It's basically what they think it is a temple of some kind, some sort of city that was built. It's very, very high up, and it's built basically on top of a mountain, and there's nothing else around it. Now, there's a valley below where the society apparently, when they got done with this place, they buried it deliberately and then moved everything down below into the valley. Well, why would you do that? The only reason you would do that is if the valley below wasn't always habitable, at least when you first built the temple, first built the site. And my suspicion is that they're going to find many, many other sites around Göbekli Tepe at about the same level, where they actually will find cities and habitations and places where human beings lived. That's in Turkey. In Turkey, yeah. This is the latest discovery. It is at least dated to 10,500 BC. So right after the flood, right after this impact event, within a couple thousand years, people were living at high altitude. And there's no indication that they were living at the same time at lower altitudes. So, there's no indication at all that in reality that people could even live at lower altitude. It's like the higher you get, the older the ruins seem to get. And that's really, really counterintuitive to the idea that there never was a great flood. So I like artifacts. I like to hunt for artifacts. I like to, that's what I like to put my hands on is ruins, pictures of buildings, pieces of wood, mechanical devices, anything I can see from Mars or the moon that actually has some solidity to it. And of course, the ultimate artifact in this whole story would be if we could actually find Noah's Ark. So I began to think, well, okay, let's see what there is about Noah's Ark out there. And I know there have been many expeditions. I know that Jim Irwin, the astronaut from Apollo 15, had tried to find Noah's Ark for many, many years and basically said, I can't find the thing. I don't know where it is. But as I went through, I discovered that there's basically two very, very likely locations in Turkey where you might actually see the ruins of the Ark. Now, it's important to understand that in the Bible, it doesn't say that it was found on Mount Ararat. It says in the mountains of Ararat, which is an area around what's now called Mount Ararat. And, excuse me, it was basically Marco Polo who named Mount Ararat. So that was in the 1300s. So nobody really knows exactly whether this was the biblical Mount Ararat, but they do know that the area around it is called Ararat. Or at least that's, it's very similar to that. Well, this is the first choice. This is called the Ararat Anomaly. It was found on a satellite image, intelligence image that was taken in the late 1940s. And basically, they said, we don't know what this thing is. It doesn't really look like a ridge. It looks like something completely different. It looks like it might be artificial. And they kept this image secret for about 30 or 40 years before they finally released it. Now, at the time, there had been many sightings of objects on Mount Ararat that they thought might be the Ark. And this is one report from an expedition by a man named Dryas, who said that he did go up there and search something that some researchers are trying to connect and say this is the Ararat Anomaly that he actually got up to. And he took some samples, tried to take some pieces of it off, and all he found was rock. He found that it was not necessarily wood. So that doesn't specifically mean, though, that it's not the Ark, because after 12 or 13,000 years, the Ark would have become fossilized. So then we jump forward to the early 1900s, and there was a young man whose name escapes me at this moment, who was going up to the mountains of Ararat and around the area to basically look for a place to bring their sheep so that they could feed them and water them because there was a drought going on. And he says that they came through a ridge and they found this. They saw a wooden boat on the mountain that was completely intact, and this is a painting that was later made of of it, and he says that his dad lifted him up on his shoulders, and he got up on these stairs and walked up to the top of the ark and actually touched it and felt the wood and tried to like pull pieces of it off, but he couldn't pull anything off of it. It was very, very solid, and he said his dad actually shot at the side of it. That's brilliant. You know, we found Noah's Ark, let's shoot it. And it bounced off as if it was made of stone. So again, it would be like almost a fossilized object. So then later on, this was in about 1903, and then later on in the 1940s, another gentleman was hiking up there, and he claimed that he found the ark in two pieces, that it had split apart, and it was in a very similar location, and the design of it was really almost identical to the first guy's observation, but he says that the ark had broken apart. Now, what happened is there was a very great drought in the early 1900s in that area, and the glaciers receded, but what could have happened is the glaciers then came back and actually the ice and snow pushed and moved and split the ark in two and pulled it apart. So it's not unreasonable that these observations are actually of the same object. So here's a couple of comparisons of the two of them as they've been seen over the years. And later on, more photographs were taken of the area that was called the Ararat Anomaly. And this is kind of what they found. It's a very odd-looking set of, looks like structures, could be rocks, but if you look at the object on the left, it appears to be, if you look at it over here, it appears to be kind of solid. There's some vertical spikes. There's things that indicate there might be some actual structure there. So that was very interesting. And here's another picture of it from farther away. And this has long been considered a really good candidate for possibly being the ruins or the wreck of Noah's Ark. Does anybody need the air conditioning turned up in here or what? Is there anything, it's not possible? I mean, even the ladies are fanning themselves. That means it's way too hot. Okay.
Stand over here. Sit right here.
Stand right over there. Yeah, it is cooler over there. Yeah. So then in 1982, some guys went up in a helicopter and took some footage, and they found this thing. And this is not in exactly the same area as the Ararat Anomaly, but again, if you look at it, what you can see is it's very dark. It's a different color than the snow around it, and it has these vertical posts underneath, which, according to the mainstream guys, those are icicles hanging down. Okay, maybe they're icicles, maybe they're not. They look like posts to me. This looks like some sort of square, ruined object. It's an aerial shot. Here's another shot from their actual footage of what looks like a square-looking kind of ark, partially buried underneath a glacier. So that was one site. The other site, though, that I think is a better candidate that really fascinated me was what's now called the Durunapar site. And it's named after a Turkish fighter pilot who first flew over this area and took some reconnaissance photographs. Now, this is a reconnaissance photograph of the area, and it looks, I guess, like a boat. I'm pretty much think anybody not think it looks like a boat? It's okay. It's okay if you don't. You don't think it looks like a boat? Okay, you're sure you don't want me to berate you for a while because you didn't think that? So, and they thought, well, this is kind of interesting. So there was some, investigation done back in the late 1950s. This is Google Maps image of the area, and some geologists have gone there and claimed, oh, it's just a boat-shaped rock. And this, by the way, is not on Mount Ararat. It's in the mountains of Ararat, near Mount Ararat. And it's about 6,500 feet high. So here's another shot that was taken back in the 60s of the area. You can see the basic shape of what looks like, a bow and a stern. It could be a fossilized, buried boat of some kind. The question is, what would a boat be doing at that altitude? Here's a side shot of it, a recent color photograph. And you can see these sort of vertical sidewalls here. It was investigated back in 1960. Life magazine actually sent a team. Here's a better shot from the outside of the basic boat shape. And actually the guy who found it said, on the ground, a guy who found it said that he was walking along and he could see the ice was melting and he could see the shape of a boat there. And everybody in the area was like, yeah, it's a boat. Now, nobody knows how a boat got to 6,500 feet, but it is there. Here's the original expedition back in the 1960s. This is a photograph from Life magazine where they sent some Army guys up there. and investigated and dug it up. And they also sent some scientists that were really interested. But what the scientists said was that, well, all we got out of there was rock. So we didn't actually get any wood. We don't really think it's wood. We think this is just some sort of natural formation that's really, really weird looking. Well, as time has gone by, more and more people have become involved in the investigation of this site, and they've done more research. Here's again a sidewall of it. And you can actually see in this picture, at least to my mind, you can see what look like a series of regularly spaced vertical posts, okay? Which is exactly the kind of thing you would build on the side of a boat. You would build spars that would go up the side of the boat. And that to me indicates that it's not really necessarily just another boat-shaped rock on a mountain in Turkey. Again, here's some other objects, some other aspects of it from a different angle, showing the different spikes that stick up on both sides. And this all came to be kind of an obsession for a gentleman named David Fasold. And he was a researcher that was really intrigued by this whole thing. He wanted to find the Ark, and he went to the site. And this is one of the stones that they found near the site, which are called drogue stones. Now, the idea is that the Ark would have actually dragged these things behind it on ropes to stabilize the boat, and for when they wanted to anchor someplace, you would drop these down and keep the boat in place. Now, what they found is that these stones were not made from material from, let's say, the Holy Land. They were made from the same rock in this very specific area. But what Fasold found out eventually is that the natives had originally found these rocks thousands of years ago, and they had been reproducing them as kind of an homage. There's even a temple there that supposedly recreates the Temple of Noah, the temple that Noah set up after he landed. So this is the idea. The stones would be dragged behind the boat. It would keep it very, very stable. And Fasold said, okay, this is enough for me to get interested in this site at a deeper level. So he paid to have, and this is, by the way, what the boat would look like. The interesting thing about it is that the length of the boat, of the Ark in the Bible, is, I think, 550 cubits, okay, which is an Egyptian measurement. This boat-shaped rock is exactly 550 cubits. So if you think that's an accident, it might be an accident. But anyway, this is what they think the original shape of this boat might have been. It was huge. It was gigantic. It fit the proportions of the Ark from the Bible. And this is what they think is now left of it, just the eroded parts on the side. So what Fasold did is he actually used ground-penetrating radar. And when he did the ground-penetrating radar, what he found was that this boat-shaped rock had 2 keel beams. It had cross supports. It had vertical spars. In other words, it had everything that you would put into a ship if you really were building a ship. This was all underneath the ground. Solid rock, wooden stuff. So again, it's wood that's probably solidified into rock at this point. But again, this is the map, okay, that was created by the ground, okay, by the ground penetrating radar. So that is, I will just tell you, that is design, that is architecture, that is a boat. Here's an example of what it might have looked like, the upper decks of it might have looked like, sort of laid on top. That's an artist's conception. And here's Fasold again with some of the stones, the drogue stones. They actually also went through and they found, believe it or not, rivets. They found metallic rivets in the area. They've had them tested by various labs, and they've come back as a very, very weird iron ore mixture, something that is kind of difficult to create even today. But in the stories in the Bible, there is a guy named Tubal-Cain who was supposedly a master metal worker, and he helped Noah build the ark. Now, in the Russell... I want to say Russell Wilson, but that's the Seahawks quarterback. Russell Crowe movie, Tubal-Cain was the bad guy. But the fact is that there is this historical record that indicates that there was a master metal worker, and they found rivets, they found animal tissue, they found dog and cat hair inside the boat. Here's another couple of examples of the rivets that they found. And yet there are people who still say, well, there's nothing to this site and you can't take it seriously. Here is photographs of the sides of the thing, and where you can more clearly see the vertical spars. And notice also, though, on the picture on the right, excuse me, on the picture on the right, that thing sticking up out of the ground, it curves, okay? Just like a spar would curve on the side of a boat. That's the way you design boats. So all the information, all the indications are that what we're looking at is a site with a basically fossilized wooden boat that probably is I think the best candidate to actually be Noah's Ark. So then the question for me becomes, okay, so somebody built the ark, somebody had to have created it, somebody had to have played the role of the gods and warned Noah to build the boat, and who were these people? So as you get into reading Genesis, it's pretty creepy. It's a pretty weird story to read, and when you read the Sumerian versions, it's even more scary. And that talks about these guys, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, but basically the stories that Sitchin has talked about is that, when men begin to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the divine beings, who are the Anunnaki, saw how beautiful the daughters of man were and took wives from among those that pleased them. The Lord said, and by the way, when you hear, the Lord God said in the Bible, there's a big difference, because in the beginning, in the early part of Genesis, the first 2 books of Genesis, very early part, it talks about God, but it talks about God in the context of this all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful force, which is the real God that we all, have probably felt at some time in our lives. After that, God is referred to as Yahweh Elohim, okay, which is the Lord God. That's actually a title that just means some dude who was put in charge of the earth. Probably in the Sumerian Enki or Enlil. So when it says, the Lord said, my breath shall not abide in man forever, since he too is flesh, let the days allowed him be 120 years. In other words, after the floods, people would only last 120 years. And then it was that they say it was then and later too that the Nephilim appeared on earth, and the divine beings cohabited with the daughters of men and bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. Now that actually I think gives them way too much credit, because they really weren't very cool guys. So after I'm researching all this, I sat down and I watched the Russell Crowe movie Noah. And I noticed a lot of things in it that were really, really weird. For one thing, in the original, in that film, you could see stars during the day. And I'm like, wow, you could see stars during the day back before the flood. Does that mean that the other stuff about the water vapor canopies thing is not true? Or would you be able to see stars during the day because the atmosphere was different? So it showed these very, very strange kinds of visions. And there was no rain on the earth in those days, according to the Bible. There was simply a mist and a dew that was everywhere. Warm mist, warm dew, and that's what watered everything. There was no need for rain back before the flood. But then it started showing these guys. And they were called the Watchers. And I'm like, who the hell are the Watchers? And I found out there's very, very little about them in the Bible, but there is a little bit more about them in the apocryphal books of the Bible, the books that didn't make it in. But in the film, they're depicted as these rock monsters. However, when you get into it, what you find, and here they are protecting Noah against the crowds. But when you get into it, what I found was that the Watchers actually had a lot in common with the Igigi, who are Anunnaki that were actually living and working on Mars. According to Sitchin, these guys numbered 200. They were toiling on Mars, which was a way station between Earth and Nibiru, and they got sick and tired of working on Mars because Mars kind of sucks. There's no women on Mars. Mars needs women. So they came to Earth. They came to Earth, and they were very unhappy with their situation. And the number of the Watchers in the Bible is listed as 200. And the number of Igigi in the Sumerian tablets is listed as 200. So what these guys did in the Sumerian is they did the same thing as it was talked about in the Bible. They came to the earth. They were extremely unhappy. They plotted behind the back of the Lord God, who was, whoever, Yahweh Elohim, whoever was in charge. And they decided they were going to kidnap these women, the human women, and take them back to Mars as their wives, or take them someplace else on Earth as their wives. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened. So you have these two parallel stories between the Watchers and the Igigi, and it's exactly the same thing. In fact, the leader of the Igigi revolt was named Satanal, Satanal, Satanal. So I'm thinking, okay, this has some connection with Sitchin and the Anunnaki, Enki and Enlil. I'm trying to figure out exactly what it is. We all know about this stuff. We know about these different cylinder seals that depict, Enki and Enlil, the rulers of the earth, the guys who quarrel. It shows that they came from the 12th planet, Nibiru. And there's different debates about whether this stuff is accurate, but it seems to be absolutely accurate. And then there's one part of the story that is really kind of controversial of Sitchin's story. It is the idea that something hit Tiamat, which was the primordial earth, and broke off a huge chunk of it. And the scientists and the engineers say, well, that's a bunch of crap. That couldn't possibly have happened. The earth would not have survived, blah, blah, blah. But this is what Sitchin says actually happened. In fact, this is what the Sumerians say happened to the earth. Now, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson will say this never happened, that there's no history of anything like this, that this is all a bunch of crap. But in fact, if you look at the earth without the oceans, it doesn't look like a planet. It looks like a fucked up corn nut. Sorry, I had to swear there. It's an effed up corn nut. Now there is every object in this solar system of any significant size is spherical. The earth is only appears to be spherical because of all the water. The water is a volatile. It could be burned away by a solar flare in a flash. And what you would be left with is that. Now, there is no explanation for that whatsoever except Sitchin's.
Is that the scale?
Yeah.
That is
Well, no, it's not to scale. The Earth is actually quite a bit bigger than that, but yeah.
between the two.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's distorted that much.
That's from NASA, yeah, yeah. Now, this goes back to stuff about the moon. The moon is basically found to be made up of the same material as the Earth, and I think that probably the Earth in a primordial stage flung off, in its spin energy, flung off some material that made up the moon. But there is no explanation for this in science at all. Everything, every moon you look at, even Ceres. You guys see Ceres in the asteroid belt with the bright glowing stuff? It's spherical. So if it's hard as rock, it's spherical. If it's a gas giant, it's spherical. The Earth is the only object of any significant size in this solar system that is not spherical. And the only way that could happen is if something hit it. Exactly the way the Sumerians said thousands and thousands of years ago. So Sumer 1, Neil deGrasse Tyson 0. I don't know if Neil, but yeah, Neil made some crack about, well, when you don't have a debate about the spherical Earth and then invite the flat earthers to come in. And I'm like, Neil, it's not spherical. It's not. So again, this is the history that Sitchin talked about Tiamat coming and being hit, being struck, and the Earth being created out of that. And then we get into the whole concept, as you guys know, probably later on, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know, about the creation of man, about how Enki and Ninmah got together and created man. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at Sitchin's writing, what you find is that, early on, there's this whole thing that's created this idea that we were created as a slave race, right? That we're a slave race. We're supposed to be, they're going to come back. They're going to claim us as their property. We're all going to, we're all screwed. That they never really cared for us and all this stuff. And as you read his later writing, what you find is that that's actually not true. There were very, very intense debates about whether it was moral to create man. There were intense debates about whether we were beings or creatures. Ultimately, the Anunnaki decided we were beings, meaning we had souls and consciousness. And we had to be treated with a certain amount of respect. That didn't mean they had to give us everything that they had, like the long life that they have, but this was all encoded into our genetics. And it was part of the process. So Enki and Ninmah were the ones who basically started this. And then as you go through the creation of man, and again, I don't think the Anunnaki were giants. There's this whole thing that the Nephilim means giants, and they were 13 feet tall, and you see Michael Tellinger with his giant footprint, which maybe a footprint, maybe not. Maybe there were giants on the earth at one time, but here's the example. Here's the stela that shows Ninmah. And their names change, so I'm just going to stick with one name, right? I could call her Isis. She would basically be Isis in the Egyptian. With the Adamu, with the first man. Who, and by the way, well, and this is interesting stuff, but the first man, look at the size of him. Okay, he's a baby. Of course they're going to look bigger because he's a baby and he had to grow up. So I question whether or not the Anunnaki or the Ajiji were really these giants. I mean, seriously, if you were 10, 12 feet tall, could you really mate with a human female without killing her? I don't know if that's, I don't think so. I've always been like, I don't think that's correct. Plus, I mean, would you even be attracted to a girl who was that tall compared to you? I don't think so. So the fact is that there's a lot of stuff in Sitchin as you read the later part, his later writings, I started reading this stuff and I got really, really interested in why it was so different than the original depictions. And again, here's the relationship between Isis, Osiris, Horus, Set, and then there's this little guy here that was created. This is basically depicting the same thing in the Egyptian later on. So I started to talk to friends of mine who'd known Sitchin, and I'm going to tell you just what he told me, because this guy knew Zach and interviewed him many times and was very good friends with him. And what he told me was that Sitchin had discovered that a lot of the things he had thought at the beginning in the original books were not actually correct. That there was, in fact, the Anunnaki were in fact moral people. They were moral beings, and they really did think very long and very hard about what they were doing here. And they were very unhappy about the way things ended up. So again, you've got Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Set. These are the ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses, and these are the ones that NASA seems to be most interested in, because they seem to be repeating their symbolism over and over and over in the space program. Here's some other depictions of them. Isis, again, basically is the same thing as Ninmah. So what seemed to have happened is that the Anunnaki were here for a long time. They created man to be a worker. And at some point in the story, there was all kinds of stuff that happened between Enki and Enlil, one who hated man, one who loved man, and it went back and forth in this argument. And at the end, things had become really a mess. And Anu, who was the king, Anunnaki, those were his people, basically said, look, we have to leave this place. We got the goal, we got what we need, our atmosphere is rebuilt, we're not doing anything good here, we're just making a bigger mess of things, so we need to get out of here. And they all started to leave, but there were a few that did stay behind. And it's interesting because if you read certain passages in the apocryphal books of the Bible, it says that 10% of the giants, of the Nephilim, of the Ajiji, of the Watchers survived, and they started to rebuild society. And what I think happened is that they basically all left after the disaster that took place with the exchange of nuclear weapons. But a few stayed behind and kept themselves here as kings, because let's face it, it is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. And the very last of these guys was Goliath. He was probably the last of the Anunnaki kings, and David put an end to him with his slingshot. Now, and David had a very, very royal bloodline. If you go back to his bloodline, it basically traces all the way back to the sons and daughters of Enki and Enlil. And it's fascinating as you go through it, and this is all in greater detail in the book, but it's fascinating as you go through it, because what you find is that, all these biblical stories are actually have all this basis in the Sumerian stuff. And like every single one of them, there's even, one of Enki's sons by a human woman was named Cain. And one of Enlil's sons by a human woman was named Abel. And Cain kills Abel. And so you have all these stories that start as Sumerian stories of these aliens, and they end up being guys that appear just in the Hebrew Bible. So what happened at the end was that there was a massive nuclear exchange. Basically, Marduk, the son of Enki, had gotten out of hand, and he had caused several revolts. He was really furious because his uncle, Enlil, was given charge over the earth because of the very bizarre, not really bizarre, but because of the rules of succession that the Anunnaki had for kingship. Enlil was actually declared the Lord of the earth. Whereas Enki was the guy who came here, he risked everything, he had helped build the first bases here, he helped build the first cities, he had done everything, and Marduk, his son, didn't really think that that was very fair. Now, they tried to do different things with Marduk. They sent him to Lamu, which is Mars. It ended up being renamed after Marduk. It ended up being renamed Mars. They tried to do things to placate him, but they really couldn't. So, as time went by, this conflict took place, and in the end, Marduk was the one who ended up ruling supreme. What he did then was he is actually the guy who started what we now call in modern times the secret societies, and that's the next segment. So as we look at our ancient history, we have sites like Yonaguni, which is off Japan. It's under about 30 or 40 feet of water. It would have to be at least 10,000 years old. There are arguments and debates about whether this thing is natural or artificial. Somebody told Linda that it was natural. She thinks it's natural. You look at this thing, and clearly it's been constructed. It wasn't formed by waves. And if you really want to get down to it, there's also Mesoamerican headdresses and things like that very near Yonaguni. So it's definitely not a natural formation, and it's over 10,000 years old because at one time it was above the ground. This is actually interesting. The one on the picture on the right is from a History Channel show about Yonaguni from the early 2000s. Or they actually sent a team of divers down and found this thing, this Mesoamerican-looking headdress, and like nobody ever talks about that. I mean, that's actually my screen cap from the show, and I'm like, I don't get why nobody talks about it, but that's pretty much proof that Yonaguni is not a natural formation. So here's a close-up of the face.
Which part of Japan is that?
It's south of Japan. It's an island south of Japan, I believe, southern part. Okinawa. And then you have other things that indicate that there was some sort of great flood. Here's a salt lake in Turkey, again about 5,000 feet up. How did salt water get 5,000 feet up a mountain? Salt water's only in the oceans. Mountains have fresh water because of rain and ice and snow. So what seems to have happened is after the flood, we have this location of Darunapar where we have what looks like the ruins of Noah's Ark. And after that, as you trace human civilization, it basically comes down out of the mountains near Ararat, across the desert into Sumer, ancient Sumer, and into ancient Egypt, the Nile Delta. It's a very clear path, as you can see, what they now call, the Fertile Crescent, where these different civilizations, Assyria, Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, Upper and Lower Egypt, suddenly came into existence at some time before the birth of Christ. Nobody really knows the exact time frame, but it's probably been within the last 10, 12,000 years. As the waters receded, these civilizations sprang up. So what the Anunnaki were doing was rebuilding these different civilizations. These are the guys involved, the dramatis persona. There's Anu, who was the king, Enlil, who was the son that didn't care for the human race that much, and Enki, the one who created him, and then Ninhursag, who is Ninmah. That's the daughter. Now this is really interesting too because how much? We're doing good, right? I've got an hour. Okay. Enki was supposed to marry Ninmah or Ninhursag. They were supposed to be married because Enki was the son of Anu by a concubine. Enlil was the son of Anu by a legal spouse. So there was a big difference between those two from a royal lineage and all. So that's why Enlil was basically, even though he was born second, was given a lot of dominance over the earth. But the problem was that Ninhursag had the hots for Enlil. So she had an affair with him, had a baby, and all this got all messed up, and there was a lot of rivalry between the two brothers. Partly over the girl, partly over the earth, partly over all these different things that had taken place back. And what Enki was trying to do was impress his father enough to basically be put in line to be the king. And in many ways, I think Enki would have been a better king than Enlil. Eventually what happened was, as you read through this stuff, what happened was that Enlil, he saw these, basically anything he saw, he took. He saw some of these maidens that Ninhursag brought to earth who were there to do healing. He raped them, she found out about it. She got all pissed off. And then Enki started sweet talking her, saying, babe, Ninmah, I love you. You're beautiful. I want you to be my wife. It's the way things are supposed to be. Come back with me. And then he just came at her once he got her to come to his secret enclave and came at her and knocked her up two times and kept trying to knock her up again because he wanted to have a son who would then have some sort of primacy over Enlil's sons. And after a while, she just couldn't take it anymore, and she said, look, that's it, I'm done. And she went back to Enlil and went back to the main Anunnaki bases. But it's bizarre, as you read this stuff, as you read these stories, the later stuff that Sitchin wrote, it's really tragic, because all this stuff was basically just the same sort of human frailties and weaknesses that we have. You know, lust, power, all the different things that happened were just really, really sad. And they ended up culminating in a really, really bad event. So there's some of the other gods and goddesses of the Anunnaki who played out. They all had sons and daughters. Marduk was a son of Enki by a human woman, not two human women. That would have been really difficult. And they had technology. They created different things. That this is Enki and Enlil basically fighting over the tree of life, I guess. Enki didn't really want man created, and he was really pissed off when he found out that they had gone against his will and created man anyway, and put them in the Garden of Eden. And he's the one who said, get them out of here. The place was actually called Eden, the Eden, E-D-I-N. That's what it was called. Get them out of the Eden. So that was the expulsion of man from paradise, basically because Enlil got pissed off because his brother had gone behind his back and created the human race. So as we went through all this stuff, and these guys trying to impress Anu the king, what ended up happening was that there was a challenge to Anu's kingship. Now, they were naked. So this is right out of Game of Thrones, where you had single combat for the kingship. They actually had laws like this. Now, what had happened was that back on Nibiru, as things had deteriorated, there was a guy named Alalu who was in charge of he was the king. He had deposed the previous king, and the previous king had panicked and actually fallen from a great height and died. So Alalu was kind of not a very good king. He screwed things up. Anu finally challenged him, and they got involved in single combat. Anu defeated him, and he became the king. So what Alalu did then is, after his defeat, is he stole the spaceship, because he was afraid that Anu was going to kill him the way he had killed his predecessor. And where did he take the spaceship? He took it to Earth. And what he was looking for was gold. Now, at the time, this was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, because they really had never traveled in space that much, even though they had high technology. Alalu used nuclear weapons to blast his way through the asteroid belt and get to Earth. And when he landed in his ship, he still had 7 of them left. Those were eventually hidden away. But what happened was that Enki followed him to Earth. They came to an agreement that Alalu would be given rulership over the Earth if, in fact, his claims that he had found gold were proven to be true. And, in fact, they did prove to be true. And a way station was set up on Mars, where they would transfer the gold from the Earth to Mars and then eventually on to Nibiru. And at the end of the situation, Alalu was not satisfied. He said, look, it's not enough for me to rule over this crappy little planet. I really don't like it here. It's cold. The sun's too bright. It burns my eyes. I have to wear sunglasses. Yeah, Bono can thank Alalu for sunglasses, because that's where our genetics came from. And I don't want that. I want to be king again. If I'm gonna save Nibiru, I want to be king again. And Anu said, no way. Anu eventually came to Earth. They engaged again in single combat, and Alalu lost again. Now, after that, Alalu did something really, really unpleasant that I'm not going to talk about, but because I think it's more symbolic. Basically, he bit off Anu's dick, is what he did. But yeah, that's what the story says. But I don't know how true that is. But yeah, I know. And are you shocked that I said that, or are you shocked that that's what the story says? Yeah. It is retold in the Egyptian story with Horus and so forth. Yeah, it's basically a retelling of that. And so that was considered, believe it or not, a fatal offense. That didn't go over really well. So what happened was Alalu was banished to Mars. He was given the rulership of Mars, but that's it. That's all. You're going to stay there till you die. So the story goes that an expedition later on came through from Nibiru, stopped on Mars to check and see what had happened. And what they found was that Alalu was dead. He had died. Actually, the what he had done had poisoned him. And, again, I don't think it was really that he swallowed Anu's penis and that poisoned him. I think there was something so poisonous in the act that he had done, which I think was this is symbolic of some other act that he did, was so bad that it kind of poisoned his soul and his body died. And when they arrived on Mars, there's stories of how they used resurrection technology to resurrect his assistant who had gone with him. But they could not resurrect Anu. And they said, well, where's Alalu? And they said, well, where's Alalu? We said, well, we put him in a mountain and built a tomb for him there. And so the expedition leader said, no Anunnaki king has ever died or been buried anywhere other than Nibiru, but Anu says he cannot be brought back to Nibiru ever. So we're going to build a tomb for him here. And according to the Sumerian story, the tomb that they built was this, the face on Mars. It was built depicting him with a space helmet on, which is what the frame around the face is supposed to be, because he had been a hero. He had actually come and rescued them because he came to Earth, took the risk, discovered the gold. So all this stuff is like, I'm reading this and I'm going, wow, this is connecting every dot that I've ever wanted to be connected. And the one thing that they never gave us, the humans, is they never gave us the secret of their long life. According to Sitchin's later stuff, it wasn't that there was a 3,600-year orbit and that was 1 year for them. What it was is that they had elixirs and foods that they ate that were very special that kept them alive much, much longer than typical human lifespan. They only gave us a 1,000-year lifespan, and of course with the degradation of the environment, it's now about 120 years. So this is a depiction of the elixirs of life being offered to man, but ultimately Anu said, no way, because if you do that, they're going to have everything that we have. They have our intelligence, they have they have basically our genetics, our DNA, our intelligence. They'll be able to challenge us if they live as long as we do. We need to make sure that there's limitations on them. There's also stories in there that are interesting, and not to be too phallically focused here, but that the biggest difference that they found between humans and Anunnaki was that we had foreskins. And they were like, wow, that's really weird because we don't have that in the Anunnaki, but somehow it came out in the genetic mix, and that's the reason why especially in Jewish religion, why there's circumcision is because the idea is to make us look identical to the gods. So that was like stuff that I found that I'm like, wow, that's really fascinating and interesting. So what eventually happened is that Enki and Enlil kind of took a back seat. They'd been here a long time. Things had not gone so well. Marduk came along. This is Marduk depicted taming a lion-dragon thing. I don't know what the heck what that is, but basically he was furious that his father Enki was not ruling over the earth because he had done everything. He had built everything that was on the earth at that time. And he was determined to rule, but he kept attacking before he was ready. He kept starting wars when he shouldn't have been doing that because he just wasn't quite prepared yet. He was very, very anxious. Now, what the Egyptians, not the Egyptians, but what the Sumerians had was something that they called the Tablets of Destinies. And I started reading about this, and I became really fascinated because there was an observatory where all the Tablets of Destinies were kept. That's another thing Alalu did, is he stole the Tablets of Destinies. And they were basically astronomical and astrological charts that not only told you how to navigate from Earth to Nibiru at any given time, but how to do it when the stars were aligned in the proper place and how to pick the right person to go. In other words, they basically understood that there was this balance and connection between the stars and the planets and consciousness. And what Enki kept trying to tell Marduk was, hey, your time is coming. You look at the stars, you're eventually going to rule over this planet. You're going to be number one. Just stop starting all these wars and fighting. But Marduk, the god of war, Mars is named for him, just couldn't stop it. He just couldn't stop doing it. So what he did eventually was there was a very charismatic young couple named Inanna and Dumuzi. And they were sons of, Dumuzi was a son of Enlil. Inanna was a beautiful daughter of another Anunnaki queen or king. And they became lovers. They were incredibly passionate for each other. It was like basically Romeo and Juliet, and somebody told me some of the other stories of Lafayette are based on their love for each other. It's like this historic, epic Antony and Cleopatra thing. Of course, Romeo and Juliet, Antony and Cleopatra, what happens to them? Their love kills them, right? They die. Well, what happened is that Marduk saw that this young couple was very charismatic, very, very beloved by the other Anunnaki, and he saw them as a threat. So what he wanted to do is get rid of Dumuzi, and he had his guys chasing him, and they didn't kill him directly, but Dumuzi fell again from a very high height and died in the fall. Now, Inanna was the wrong person to screw with, because she was an expert pilot, she was a military leader, she was not happy with Marduk. In fact, there's stories that she actually chased him to a place that sounds like it sounds exactly like the Great Pyramid, and was using all sorts of beam weapons and things to try to attack him in there and get him. Eventually what happened was peace was made, Marduk was allowed to come out, and Inanna went off and was given her own place to rule. So what we ended up with was these different kingdoms. There was an Anunnaki kingdom in Mesopotamia. There was an area that was ruled over by humans and Anunnaki jointly. There was the Indus Valley, which Inanna was given to basically as part of the peace thing. You go over there and you rule the Indus Valley, the Indian civilization, and they were allowed to create their own languages and religions, because the idea was they wanted to separate us. They wanted to make sure that we could not unite because we reproduce so much faster than them. They didn't want us to be of one mind. So this was part of the Anunnaki plan. And eventually, Marduk was given an area which was known as Babel. Now, what Marduk did, do you think that Marduk, after all this, was chastened? Do you think maybe he was not going to continue? No, he was definitely ready to continue the whole battle, and he started building his own spaceport, which is basically the Tower of Babel. And when the other Anunnaki found out about this, they were really, really unhappy, and basically the sons of Enlil went to the council and said, this is the last straw. We got to get rid of this guy, and we have to take this thing out. So they got together an air force. They went and found the nuclear weapons that had been hidden away for a couple of 100,000 years that Alalu had brought to the earth, and they went after him. The tower was destroyed, but then what happened was the son of Enlil, who was in command of the ship with the nuclear weapons, went overboard. He's like, screw this, I'm going to make myself or my dad, my line, supreme. I'm going to destroy the other Anunnaki cities. And he went and he nuked the Indus Valley. He nuked the areas in Sumer. He just basically dropped all these nuclear weapons off. But see, these were called weapons of terror, and they were not used very often. They had not been used for thousands of years, and they didn't actually understand what they were and what the consequences were. So they didn't think about nuclear fallout. So what happened then is the evil wind, which came from the east and basically wiped out every major Anunnaki settlement all through the Middle East, except one. Babel survived. And Enki and Enlil looked at the destruction, looked at everything that had been caused by all of their flings and affairs and all their conflict, and they got together, and Enki said, look, this is proof that it's Marduk's time to rule. This is proof that he's the guy that needs to be in charge. You need to leave this planet. You need to take your guys and go home, all your kids, and leave this planet to Marduk, because that's clearly what the stars are telling us. See, they believed in fate and destiny. And what they considered fate was what happened due to individual choice. The consequences of individual choice, karma. Destiny was that which had been predestined by the creator of everything before time had ever come. And basically what Enki said to his brother is, this has got to stop. We've made a complete mess of this place. Let's just get out of here and leave it to Marduk to figure out what to do. So that apparently is what they did, except I don't think Enki ever left. So, which we'll get into in a minute. So what then happened was that Marduk went to Egypt, because even Babylon itself was not really a very pleasant place to live after all that had happened. So he went to Egypt and created a cult around himself. He called himself Ra. He had sons, Osiris, Asar, and Isis, and he had them. And he kind of took a lot of the things that had happened and applied those myths to his religion that he started in ancient Egypt. Now, if you want proof of this, or proof that this stuff, something like this actually happened, one of the best places to go is to go to the Osirian, which is in Abydos, Egypt. Now, I've never been there. By the way, that's an awesome 12 shirt there. All right. Oh, and a Dick's Drive-In on top of it. All right. Sorry, from Seattle. So, in the Osirian is probably the oldest structure in Egypt. It does not have any of the typical hieroglyphs on it. A lot of stuff was added later. But what happened years ago, and you guys may have heard of this, was that there was a panel on a wall, this one right here, very, very high up, and there was some hieroglyphs over the front of it, and the front panel fell off. And when they looked at what was behind it, which is thousands of years older, what they found was images of tanks, helicopters, airplanes, maybe spaceships. This is in Abydos, Egypt, at the temple of Seti I. So it's adjacent to the Osirian. Now, somebody immediately made a fake of this and changed it. And so there's been this big controversy whether it was fake or whether it was real. So my old pal, Richard C. Hoagland from Dark Mission, he was on a show called Opening the Lost Tombs in Egypt or something. Zahi Hawass was on it. This is like 98. And he said, look, here's what you got to do. Go to Abydos, start the camera outside, and then walk into the Osirian, walk into the temple, and walk right up to this thing and show people that it's there. That's exactly what they did. This is a screen capture from this. The other thing, too, is that all the other hieroglyphs around it discuss, this is the outside shot of the outside of the Osirian. All the other glyphs around this, these images of tanks and planes and helicopters, Apache helicopters, say what they're talking about is war. They're talking about how this god, Seti I, defeated the enemies of the 9 bows and all this stuff. In other words, everything around these war machines that are depicted here discusses wars and battles. So logically, these are depictions of war machines. Here's the tank. Looks a little bit like an M1 Abrams tank. Here's the helicopter. Looks a little bit like an Apache. Now, the experts say that these are what's called a palmipest, and palmipest, something like that. And did I pronounce it right? I know. Yeah. And what they're saying is that, oh, well, you had this original stuff, and then you had this other plaster laid over it, and some of that fell off and created a new form that wasn't there before. Now, the thing is with palmipest is that can happen, but those are, you always see big chunks of them taken out. You always see that they're dirty and beat up and everything. And even one Egyptologist said, well, the problem I have with that explanation for these is that these are in pristine condition. There's like nothing, there's no indication of any plaster that was attached to them that pulled anything off. So again, it's just complete nonsense. So you do have these depictions of these wars that took place. You also have at the in the temple of Seti, you have images of himself, and there's this wall, the Hall of the Kings, and it names every single Egyptian pharaoh going back in time. But it goes back not just a couple thousand years before the pyramids, pre-dynastic or dynastic Egypt. It goes back, if you count the lifespans, almost 12,000 years. They name each individual ruler of Egypt. And I'm sure Marduk is in there somewhere because he was the first guy. So what you have is you actually have a wall there that says our civilization is at least 12,000 years old. Which brings me to NASA. So all this started out because I knew a lot of things about NASA. What I know about them, what we wrote about in Dark Mission, is that NASA is obsessed with the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, specifically Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Those are the most specific guys that keep coming out in all their symbolism. And as you dig into secret societies, what was the purpose of the secret societies? Where did they start? Well, where they started was that Marduk had a discussion with his father and Enki, and they decided that what should happen is that we should leave the earth. The Anunnaki should leave, but we should teach them our ways of civilization, which, given the fact that there'd been a nuclear war and rape and murder and all this other stuff, I don't know how civilized they really were, but this is what they decided that they would do. So when Marduk went to Egypt, he created a secret priesthood in which he told them all of the secrets of the Anunnaki, except that of long life. That's the one thing they wouldn't give to us. And these secret societies, this priesthood, was supposed to teach us over the years as we developed the ways of civilization and the secrets of the Anunnaki, the science of the Anunnaki, how to create new organisms, how to create new forms of food. I mean, there's things like corn, maize, just appears after the flood period about 12,000 years ago, just out of nothing. Somebody spliced that together. Somebody figured out how to do that, and it wasn't probably the Indians. It was somebody else who knew a lot about how to create foods that were very nutritious. So what I knew about NASA was that they had a lot of secret societies that were involved with them at various levels. And there was basically three of them. What I call the magicians out at JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. These guys were followers of Aleister Crowley. They were into a little bit of black magic. And even the Anunnaki writings talk about using magic, using intonations, using things like that to move material and do things. They had technologies that were based on that. And they also had the Nazi movement, the Nazi faction, which is Werner von Braun and his buddies. And then there was the Freemasons, who seemed to be the guys who controlled everything. Well, the most famous Freemason at NASA is this guy, Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. Now, if you look at this picture of Buzz, this is when he was a commander of an Air Force base in the mid-1960s. The thing you notice is that he's not wearing a wedding ring, even though he was married. He's wearing his grandfather's Masonic signet ring. And in fact, if you go through pictures of Buzz, what you will find is that Buzz wore this ring at all times. Here's his official Apollo 11 crew portrait with Michael Collins and Neil Armstrong. And he's making a good point of showing his Masonic signet ring. Can you guys see that? Most of the versions of this shot crop that out. They just cut it off. Yeah, most of them. But there is one or two that do exist online. Buzz, even today, every chance he gets, displays his Masonic ring. So the craft was very important to him. So one of the ways that this manifested itself, this dedication to a secret society, was that he took this particular flag, which is a Masonic 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason ceremonial apron, to the moon with him on Apollo 11. They had these little personal preference packs where they could stick all kinds of things in them. In fact, Jim Irwin, who I mentioned earlier, he took a bunch of American flags that were like silk screened onto spacesuit material. He took a couple hundred of those. My friend Ken Johnston was friends with Jim. They were in Bible study together, and I actually got one. So I actually have something that went to the moon on Apollo 15, which really is cool. And yeah, I think I'm going to sell it on Pawn Stars someday. Like, I got something you've never seen before, Rick. Something that's been to the moon. Anyway, so he brought this Masonic apron with him on Apollo 11. Here he is returning it to not Luther Vandross, but Luther Smith, who was the head of the 33rd degree Scottish Rite at that time. He was succeeded by a guy named Seafred Kleinknecht, whose son was Kenny Kleinknecht, who, by the way, was the guy who ran the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo projects. He was the project manager for those. So you have Freemasons everywhere. He brought it back to Luther. He presented it to him after taking it to the moon. Here's some more pictures of the event. There's Kleinknecht in the gray suit. Buzz's mom and dad, and he's presenting all this stuff to them saying, hey, I took this to the moon. Now, the interesting thing about Apollo 11 is that all the pictures you see of the lunar surface of an astronaut, they're all Buzz Aldrin. Not one of them is Neil Armstrong. So all of these famous pictures from Apollo 11, and especially this one, that's Buzz, that's not Neil. So I begin to think to myself, I think the reason why Neil Armstrong went out first was so he could photograph the first Freemason to walk on the surface of the moon, because that's apparently Neil's only job, was to do that. He took all these pictures of Buzz. Now, one of the things that we found out as we begin to dig into it was that if you looked at the hierarchy of NASA, you had Freemasons and these magicians and guys at all different levels, Nazis at all different levels. Here's a little organization chart I put together. James Webb was the director of NASA. He was Kennedy's director of NASA. He was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason. Kenny Kleinknecht was the director of Projects Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. He was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason. His brother eventually ended up running the whole thing. A lot of the astronauts, including Ed Mitchell, who is on Skype right now, were 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemasons. Buzz was 32nd degree when he went there to the moon. I'm pretty sure he was made 33rd right after that. Then at JPL, you have Theodore von Karman, who actually helped start the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Very famous scientist from the 30s and 40s, probably on a par with Einstein. And he used to claim that he had created a golem to smote his enemies. And a golem is a being that is, in Jewish lore, that is an artificial construct, but that is endowed with life by the guy who creates it, and basically performs any function he wants him to. There's rumors that the reasons the Nazis walled off the Warsaw Ghetto is because the Jews kept calling up golems to tear them apart, but I don't know if any of that's true. You got Werner von Braun, Hubertus Strughold, character was named after him in the X-Files movies, and Kurt Debus, who was the director of the Johnson Space Center. We're all Nazis. Here's a picture of Mr. Webb. There's a telescope named after him now. He seems to be a pretty good guy. Don't really know, but he wasn't. But in other words, you had to be a member of one of these secret societies to be in a senior position at NASA during the Apollo program. This is Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was also a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason. He's basically the guy who was Roosevelt's and Truman's science advisor, and he was the guy who basically formed NASA. He was the one who conceived of it. He was the one who created it. He was also a Scottish Rite Freemason. Here's another picture of von Karman with some equations behind him. And von Karman's pal was this guy, Jack Parsons, John Whitesides Parsons. I'm sorry? Yeah. To put it mildly, Parsons was a nut. Okay, he was a Looney Tune, but he was a great chemist, and he actually invented solid rocket fuel. So in other words, the solid rockets that we have now that we're able to shoot stuff into space are basically because of different inventions that Parsons came up with. He was also a follower of Aleister Crowley, who, I don't know if you guys know too much about him, but basically do a search on Led Zeppelin, you'll find all about Aleister Crowley. Crowley was, he called himself the wickedest man in the world. He basically dressed like Osiris. He dressed like a Scottish Rite Freemason. He basically took every esoteric degree there is and everything you could imagine. He was a guy who was fascinated with the occult, and Jack Parsons was his buddy and became the leader of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, in the United States, which was Crowley's temple. Was Jack Parsons was the guy who ran it for him, because Crowley couldn't get into the United States because he had such a bad reputation. Parsons then, after he took over in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, became friends with benefits with this lady, Marjorie Cameron. Marjorie Cameron, I think, and I can't prove it yet, but I'm pretty sure, is related to the film director James Cameron. I believe he is a grandson or a son or something. Now, I can't prove that yet, but I'm working on it, and I've got some evidence. Marjorie Cameron was also the secretary to the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States of America. And one day, she quit her job and went directly to Jack Parsons' mansion in Pasadena. Parsons had been out in the desert with another guy you may have heard of named L. Ron Hubbard. And what they were doing was some incantations to create an elemental, a red-haired, green-eyed goddess, which Marjorie had red hair and green eyes. And the idea was that he was then going to knock up his elemental. She was going to then give birth to a daughter who would be the whore of Babylon, who Parsons would then, when she was of age, rape, basically, and create the Antichrist. So Jack Parsons This is a guy who was a founding member of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And he wanted to basically create the Antichrist. I said he was a nut, right? So,
Is this in the book?
oh yeah, this stuff's in the book. There's also some of the stuff about it in Dark Mission. Here is the day of the formation of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in 1936 in a place called, wait for it, Devil's Canyon. This is Devil's Canyon near Pasadena, and this is the day that they did the first successful rocket experiment test, which led to the funding of GALCIT, which became the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. There's a guy named Ed Foreman. The guy leaning very confidently back up against the stack of sandbags there is Jack Parsons, it's Jack Parsons in the front. And this is considered the birth of JPL. So when did this rocket test take place? It was in 1936. Guess what day? Halloween. 1936. They formed this. And even today at JPL on Halloween, they put out what they call a nativity scene, reenacting the very first rocket test in the Devil's Canyon.
Halloween.
What's that?
We were in Halloween.
Oh, well, you know. Yeah. You ever wonder what they dress up like on Halloween at JPL? Yeah. All I can say is this is a guy who helped form a key part of NASA. It's like, do you ever wonder who they think is weird? So, after NASA was formed in 1958, the first thing they did is they went out and they commissioned a study from the Brookings Institute called basically the Brookings Report. It was basically, the actual title is Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs. And what it was it was a cultural study to try to determine what NASA should do if they found something out there. And of course, what they said at the beginning was you're probably not going to run into ET. You're probably not going to see aliens. You're probably not going to have direct contact. But there is a reasonable chance that on the moon or Mars or Venus that you may find artifacts. It uses that specific word, artifacts, and of course that's what we see all over the moon and Mars. So if we actually find artifacts, what should we do about it? Well, they cited a number of different examples, including the War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles in 1939. Anybody here not familiar with that? Good. Everybody's heard it, isn't it? It's really incredible. But basically what they said is, if you find artifacts, you should seriously consider not telling people, because if you tell people, you will probably drive them crazy. And the guys you'll drive the most crazy are the scientists and the engineers, because their self-esteem is wrapped up in the fact that they have mastery over nature. And if they find out that there's something much, much bigger than them out there, they'll probably go absolutely nuts. The entire film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, was based on the Brookings Report and its conclusions. Hal represented the scientists and the engineers. When he found out there was a monolith on the moon, he went crazy, and he killed all the other astronauts. So they came up with this idea, they basically issued this report, and then NASA got into business. Well, then John F. Kennedy became president. And when he took over, he changed things. He got rid of John Glennon. He put James Webb, the Freemason, in. And, Kennedy was not a big fan of secret societies. There's a very famous statement of him about how, we don't really trust secret oaths and secret societies. I don't like them very much. But yet he put a lot of these guys in charge of NASA. And, it could be that he was just under pressure to do that, or he just was too busy with too many other things. So what happened is that Kennedy, on 3 occasions, proposed to the Soviet Union that we go to the moon together. Not as separate competing space programs, but that we unite together, put our technologies together, put our brains together, and go. The Cuban Missile Crisis kind of derailed the first 2 attempts. But what happened eventually was that Kennedy, instead of doing it secretly behind the scenes through private channels, went to the UN in September of 1963 and said, I propose that the Soviet Union and the United States go to the moon together. And of course, what that means is that you're also going to discover, if you find artifacts, then the Russians are going to have the same artifacts. Not only are they going to have our rocket technology, but they're going to have the alien technology, maybe the leftover Anunnaki technology that we're going to find. This is a political cartoon shortly after that where you see Khrushchev and Kennedy being launched to the moon, and they're both very depressed. And Khrushchev says, see, I told you this would happen if you kept talking about it. But what happened was, after Kennedy made this proposal, it was extremely unpopular. However, even though it was unpopular, it seemed to have gained legs. And at some point along the line, Khrushchev finally said yes. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But behind the scenes, of course, you had guys at NASA like Wernher von Braun. Here is Dr. Wernher von Braun. And the guy standing in front of him is Heinrich Himmler. Which, if you know anything about Nazi Germany, Heinrich Himmler was a douche. This is actually von Braun in his SS uniform. And he claims this is the only time he wore it. It was for his induction to the SS. It was a favor to his personal buddy, Heinrich Himmler. But, you know, the original Project Paperclip said that you're not supposed to bring any ardent Nazis over with you, over as part of the project. I don't know. Would this qualify somebody as an ardent Nazi? I would think so. The SS, you have to remember, is also a secret society. It's basically a secret society. Here's a picture of von Braun with Der Fuhrer when Adolf came by to visit and see how his rocket programs were going. There's Werner right in the middle. There's Adolf right in front of him. There he is. Good-looking, handsome, young German man. So, with that as the background, there were people in the West who definitely didn't want us to be sharing our technology. Yet Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually talked, and according to Nikita Khrushchev's son, this is a picture of them in Vienna, and this is him giving the speech at the UN where he said we should go to the moon jointly. This is exactly what he said. Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there's room for new cooperation for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among those possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. So Kennedy actually said this in public and really pissed a lot of people off. Now, the whole thing seemed to have died because there was a lot of political opposition, especially a guy named Congressman Albert Thomas of Texas was really, really unhappy and said, we're not going to share it with those damn commies. But according to Sergei Khrushchev, who is Nikita Khrushchev's son, he's now a scholar and a diplomat at Brown University, about a week before Dallas, his father agreed with Kennedy to go to the moon together. Because he said, the Americans are already ahead of us. They move too fast. They're too smart. We're not going to beat them to the moon. It's going to embarrass us, so let's go together. Now, that story is, some people dispute the story, that Khrushchev actually agreed. But Sergei says it was about a week before Kennedy was assassinated. Well, the proof of that is in a couple of national security action memos. Because what Kennedy did is he issued two memos on November 13th. I can't read that. 12th? So, yeah. 11 days before he was assassinated in Dallas. Kennedy issued two national security action memos. The first one instructed James Webb to open an office to begin technology transfer and information exchange with his Soviet counterparts. The second one is this one, which is more controversial. Now, people have said that, Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to reveal all of our UFO secrets to the Russians. That's not the reason. That's not what this memo says. What this memo is, this is directly to the CIA director, and what he says is, we need to share our information on, quote, bona fide UFOs with the Russians so they will know the difference between bona fides, extraterrestrial spacecraft, and our experimental craft. So he was instructing the director of the CIA to inform the Russians, who had just pointed nuclear missiles at us about a year before from Cuba, all about our secret technology. I think the question is not who wanted to kill Kennedy, it's who didn't want to kill Kennedy. So, all I can say is that 10 days after those memos were issued, John F. Kennedy was dead.